Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Hello, I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces. My name is Jennifer Ditchburn. I'm the president and CEO of the IRPP. Thank you, and hello to everyone who's watching us on the live stream of this event. Thank you for tuning in. I want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and we can see the Kitchissippi River from this beautiful setting that we're in today. The Algonquin Anishinaabe people have been the guardians of and the keepers of this territory, the lands and waters, for millennia. We're talking about affordability issues today, and it's important, and climate issues. It's important to take on board that Indigenous people in Canada disproportionately feel the effects of inflation, of climate change, of the deepening housing crisis. In Algonquin culture and in Anishinaabe culture, there's the 7 grandfather teachings, and among those teachings are the principles of humility and respect. And so in our work and in our discussion today, I think we can move forward with those principles in mind as we discuss affordability and also climate action. So we're co-hosting this event with the Affordability Action Council. This group came together a year ago, over a year ago, to see how we could advance a conversation about affordability and climate change at the same time. Those are 2 intersecting ideas. And the council is a collaboration of experts from across the country. It's a nonpartisan group and also includes community organizations. The IRPP was a research lead on this council. And it released a key package of recommendations, which you can find on the AAC's website and also on the IRPP website. I think there'll be a slide up that will show you how you can access all those recommendations. And we addressed 3 sections of the question. So housing, food, and transportation. Those were the 3 areas that we focused our research on. For example, I'll give you a few examples, and I think you have a sheet that was distributed for the people who are here in the room with some of the recommendations that we had. We've recommended that when the federal government frees up land for affordable housing projects, that it prioritize property that's near transit, that the Canada Infrastructure Bank help make sure those new housing builds are net zero and climate resilient. If you're going to build, why not make them climate resilient? The federal government's electric vehicle program, it should also help people buy used EVs, e-bikes and e-scooters. And we proposed a new energy retrofit program that focuses on the lowest income households in the country. But we realize that there's a lot of other approaches to affordability, and the different political parties in our system have different lenses on the issue. They also have different lenses on climate resilience and how we can approach climate action. So our panel today brings together 3 experts. I think you'll recognize some of them from their appearances on other shows, but who come from different sides of the political equation and will give us their perspective on some of these questions, the intersecting questions about affordability and climate action. Tyler Meredith was previously the lead economic advisor for Justin Trudeau, Bill Morneau, and Chrystia Freeland. He is a founding partner of Meredith, Bosanquet, and Phillips Policy Advisors and a senior fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and formerly with the IRPP. We seem to have crossed paths when I was coming into the IRPP and Tyler was leaving. Kathleen Monk is a veteran campaign strategist and an award-winning communicator who previously served as Director of Communications for the late Jack Layton. She is principal at Monk & Associates, where she dedicates her energies to advocacy campaigns, issues management, and guiding public affairs strategy. And Karen Restoule is Vice President at Crestview Strategy and Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Prior to joining Crestview Strategy, Karen led an environmental consulting firm working with Indigenous communities towards self-determination, building on a previous role supporting First Nations leadership at Chiefs of Ontario, where she worked to advance innovative and strategic policy solutions to legacy challenges. So I'm just going to take a seat here. And I'll take this mic before we start our conversation. Je voulais souligner qu'à l'IRPP, nous travaillons dans les deux langues officielles. Après notre discussion, on aura une période pour des questions. Alors, si vous voulez poser votre question en français, ce serait le bienvenu. Je pourrais le traduire pour vous et ensuite traduire la réponse aussi. So I thought, panelists, dear panelists, and we're going to make this as free-flowing as possible, but I do have some questions to pose. I wanted to start by asking, each of you has different communities you're connected with, different people you see socially in your community, in your families and so on, different work that you do. And I'm interested to hear what you're seeing in terms of affordability and what people are struggling with right now in your sphere. So Kathleen, since you're the closest person to me, I'll start with you.
Sure. I work with a bunch of different groups, but I guess one I'll focus on now is a lot of the labor unions that I work with. And I think a lot of those folks right now primarily are concerned with the instability and the fear that's coming from, obviously, the threat of the Trump tariffs and the loss of their jobs, right? Particularly Ontario, particularly in the auto sector, but in other sectors too, aluminum, you name it, wood, chemicals. We all know the reality. They're concerned, obviously, primarily right now with the existential threat, but of losing their paycheck, which kind of on the hierarchy of needs is pretty high up there. But more generally, social unionists, trade unionists, are concerned, broadly with our community and have been at the forefront of championing various social programs like the pharmacare program, like the dental care program, things that really tried to look at affordability challenges that Canadians were facing and come up with concrete plans, pushing them through to political parties, and then through the very recently demised agreement between the Liberals and the New Democrats to actually make them a reality for folks. So folks are, when I drill down in the polling and what I see and what I hear talking to folks that I work with is, obviously housing is still a major concern, and the affordability of housing, the access of housing, but also access to care and the drugs that are required. Pharmacare is still popping in some of those communities as well, and obviously worried about food, right? I mean, I talked to you about this the other day, Jennifer, when we had a pre-chat. My mother is one of a group of septuagenarians and octogenarians that operate the food bank in Ajax, Ontario, and they're all volunteers, and they don't have a lot of infrastructure around them, and the nature of the clientele that they're seeing every day is really different than it was 10 years ago, but it's so hard because of the cost of housing for folks to make ends meet, where that might have been maybe possible on ODSP or Ontario Works a few years ago. It's just not even a reality. And if you happen to be one of the very, very, very lucky few folks that happen to have subsidized housing, so maybe your check might go a little bit further. Subsidized housing often doesn't cover the cost of utilities. So then we get in a scenario where often with electric heat in those subsidized housing, that kind of shelter, it's, costs can go up hundreds of dollars extra a month. And while there are programs that I'm sure you're all familiar with that prevent utilities from being cut off like that in the winter period between November and I'm not sure exactly when it ends, then they're handed these massive bills of like $3,000, that folks don't have the capacity to pay or have the capacity really even to deal with and manage and get hooked up with various agencies or groups that can help them facilitate payment. So those are kind of some of the color, I guess, stories I would tell you, and happy to get into it more as we go along. Tyler?
So, this is on, yes. So, look, I think what Kathleen has expressed is probably a universal is a universal truth that we've all seen in different contexts in our own daily lives and also with the folks that we work with. I think what's interesting to me is the changing dynamics around who's been affected by that, and also is there a path forward to deal with this? So, you know, we are now in the third year of some version of an inflation crisis, and until we came to the result of the U.S. election, we were on a path where, you know, central bankers, and I sometimes spend my time with central bankers, would have described this as the soft landing, right? Where employment largely was held up. It actually has done relatively well. Wages have, on a real dollar basis, as much as it doesn't feel that way, wages are still higher today, even on an inflation-adjusted basis post-COVID than they were before COVID. But it doesn't feel that way because the way we often measure the consumer price index and the way we measure wages relative to the consumer price index doesn't account for the fact that people have differential reliance on certain basket of goods, right? Whether that's housing and whether that's shelter, whether that's food and other essentials. And I think what's interesting is you know, to refer to some of the polling data that Kathleen was referencing, you've seen in the last couple of years a bit of a compositional change as to what people cite as the affordability challenge. So housing has been traditionally near the top, but consistently number one in all of the level of concern around affordability has been food, right? And that remains true today as much as it was in 2022. And even as we're starting to actually see food prices stabilize, people still report that is the biggest problem that they're facing in their household budget. And housing has started to fall back, right? In part because a lot of what was driving shelter costs were two things, right? It was the inordinate pressure from population growth being placed on our housing market because of things like immigration, which have now started to abate, and we've seen rents actually begin to fall, but also mortgage costs, right? Which is, you know, in some ways a self-induced inflation associated with central bank policy rates, but those are starting to fall back. And so as those are falling back, now post U.S. election, we are in a situation where we are now faced with yet another threat to the affordability that all households are facing. Because if we just run the numbers on what a potential dollar for dollar tariff response is going to require, right? Just think about food. You know, we send the United States somewhere in the order of about $30 billion worth of farm, fish, and meat products, and we import back about $15 billion. So we have a trade surplus with the United States on that basis, but we still import about $15.5 billion worth of goods from the United States in that category. And if we have to tariff that $15.5 billion worth of goods at 25%, that's almost $4 billion a year that the federal treasury is going to collect that somehow we have to return to people quickly, because otherwise it's going to show up in the form of prices. And I think people haven't understood that dynamic is going to play out in every product category, and we're going to see. I hate to say this. Don't accuse me of saying grocer gouging, but you know, if you're a Canadian company who competes in a U.S. Product category, right, with a well-known U.S. brand name, and you know that your U.S. competitor is going to face a 25% increase in the list price, that Canadian company is going to have some incentive to capture some version of that 25% on their own price as well. And so how do we address this fact that inflation will be caused in part by the tariff that both the U.S. and Canada apply to those goods, which we will have to do in a tariff response, but that there will be a behavioral expectation on the part of Canadian businesses to do the same. And that's going to cause a huge amount of havoc in our supply chains. It's going to cause a huge amount of havoc for households. And we have not thought sufficiently critically about how we're going to avoid that and how we're going to return money to people quickly to hold households, to protect households from that inflation. So I worry a lot about this, because I would have said to you last summer, we were starting to see a clearing in the offing, that the soft landing was actually going to appear, right? That things were abating and coming under control. And now we're about to go into a trade war which is a self-induced affordability crisis. That's crazy. But that is the situation that we face, and we're going to probably talk a lot on this panel about how to deal with that. But I mean, that is just the situation that we face. I'd
like to come back to dig into the tariff issue. Karen, your home community is Doki's First Nation. 150 clicks from North Bay, more or less?
Yeah.
Yes.
An hour and a half around the lake. 45 minutes across the lake. So sometimes we take the boat, if the wind permits.
North Bay is a reference point for me. But tell us what you're hearing from people in the community, people around you, in terms of what the affordability crisis looks like for people.
Yeah,
in
this
WC.
panel is very timely. Every year in February, my family plays in a hockey tournament, where it's going into its 50th year. It's in a small town called Noelville. I don't know, does anyone know it? One person, two people? It's like a town of 1,000 people. It's like somewhere between North Bay, Sudbury, and like Highway 69. My parents met there at that high school. My dad would have grown up in Doquis First Nation. My mom grew up in a small French-Canadian town called St. Charles, which probably has less people than Noelville, but nonetheless a great neck of the woods to grow up in. So every year, families from that region, we all go to Noelville and we fight against one another on the ice, literally and figuratively. Some years are worse than others. Very much like Team Canada last week. So we gather there and families compete against one another for the championship. And I'm proud, this is a side note, I'm proud to say that the Restoule family has captured more than half of the championships. Just throwing that out there. And this year we went for the 10th year in a row, we won. Anyhow, aside's the point. What I love most about this weekend is that it's not just the players that come out, it's everybody. All the grandparents and the uncles and aunts and the kids, and you sit around and you visit. Like, visiting is not, I know people get romantic about Indigenous, traditions and whatnot. It's not just First Nations people who sit and visit. It's just like Canadians sit and visit in various forms. And in this small town, we all gather at the hall upstairs, and that's not the only time we gather, but this one in particular is my favorite one because it's cold outside. No one, everyone just stays in the hall. And the main topic of conversation was affordability. And in my family, particularly, folks know that I'm policy inclined. I do something over there in the center of the universe, known as Ottawa and Toronto. And then from time to time, they'll come to me with these points and say, what the heck's going on? Like, why is everything so friggin' expensive? Like, we just had our third kid. We're trying to figure out, how to make ends meet. Our salaries haven't gone up. The price of everything has gone up as well. And so a lot of what we've heard here from the panelists is real life for a lot of folks. And these are people who, don't work in jobs where we moisturize, is what I call the job that I have. These are people who actually have to use their hands and muscles to move things and make things. And it's scary, right? Trump got talked about, kind of comically in the past decade, I would say, around the campfire, a lot of Trump impressions and jokes. But they're now realizing that the overreach there can be very real, and it is putting them and the well-being of their families at risk. And even, I come from a place where there are gender roles, and these are men who take pride in being able to provide for their families, and they're seriously concerned about that. I'm gonna nerd out, Jen.
Yeah, go for it.
So, chatting, preparing for this post-conversation at the hockey tournament, I was like, what's the data saying, on food? What's happening there? So in Canada, in March 2024, food banks across Canada recorded over 2 million visits. This marked a 6% increase from the previous year and a staggering 90% surge since 2019. That's a Food Banks Canada data point. In Ontario, between April 2023 and March 2024, so one fiscal year, more than 1 million Ontarians accessed food banks, representing a 25% rise from the prior year and an 86% increase since 2019. It's just shocking. Toronto's food banks experienced 3.49 million visits during the same period, an increase of nearly 1 million visits compared to the previous year. So these are, stark realities that we're contending with. It's no surprise that, it's a topic of conversation at what is otherwise a beer, burp, and fart kind of weekend. Like people are talking about it in their day-to-day. Can I just add another data point?
Sure.
Just very
I'm
quick.
gonna follow up a question for you, right?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So from food to energy, when we talk about, being able to afford to heat your home, which is, kind of like a basic need, I would say. And the challenge on this, to me, is that it goes beyond, just put a sweater on if you're cold, is what the message was when I was growing up in the 80s. We know mortgage rates were astronomical. And so this is something, is my time up? Okay. And so this is something that we say at home is like, we're not turning up the heat, put a sweater if you're cold, deal with it. But in this case, it goes beyond that. So on average, Canadian households pay about $135 per month for home heating. Those using natural gas face higher costs, averaging $160 per month during the winter, compared to $110 per month for electricity. A recent census analysis revealed that approximately 822,000 Canadian households, which is 5.6%, experience energy poverty, which is defined as spending 10% or more of their after-tax income on home energy bills. And this issue is apparently more pronounced in the Atlantic provinces, with rates ranging from 10.7 to 13.7%. And of course, I won't keep reading here, but rural and northern communities sits at around the similar percentage. And so the data there is pretty stark.
So let me ask you, from a conservative perspective, because that's where your allegiances lie. What would, and
we need a little time for the people in the room to gasp. An Indigenous person also leans to the right. It's okay, people.
What's the, and I realize each of you is not an official spokesperson for your parties, but we're asking you to imagine based on your knowledge, what is the conservative approach to affordability, given all those very pertinent stats that you've given and what we've heard on stage?
Yeah, to me, Pierre Poilievre's position to provide pragmatic and commonsensical approaches really resonates with me. And it also resonates with many folks, including the cousins and friends that I visited with in the hockey rink 2 weeks ago. And it's just really like, ensuring that everyday essentials, that the prices are kept within reason. And so how do you do that, right? Like you curb public spending, you manage your inflation.
Oh, I saw a reaction next to you. This so commences the spicy part.
I didn't let my reaction show as dramatically while you were speaking, Tyler.
Go on. Yeah. So
essentially taking action to manage inflation rates, right? They've been, things have is that a hand up? No. Oh, you're combing your hair. Things have gotten out of control. That's no secret. And the public spending, whatever the rationale on the Liberal side of things has been, and I suppose even through the coalition with the NDP, has, in the opinion of many people, has grown to be a large problem. It's impacted our economy. It's impacted inflation rates. And life, as we once knew, has become virtually unaffordable. And so the obvious one is going macro and just looking at what can be done at the macro level to move things in the right direction, to at least try to save some portions of whatever good cost of living that we once enjoyed. Mm-hmm. So a bit of a, obviously I'm not an economist, I'm not using all the buzzwords, but to me, it's rather quite simple on that end, is that we have to stop spending. And so if I can kind of toss back at Tyler on his comments about retaliatory tariffs, I actually, there was a bit of knee-jerk reaction there, and I actually don't agree that we should be retaliating on tariffs. I think we should pause, sit down, have very adult and diplomatic discussions with the US, go piece by piece on what it is that we provide to them, on how it helps them become America the Great, or whatever they're calling themselves today, and at least give good old diplomacy a shot before we go and try to slap back the big giant that we share this continent with.
Now, Tyler, since you you had a reaction to what Karen said.
So, I mean, so let me clarify a couple of things. My reaction was to the villain of public spending, because the inflation that we have experienced up till now, I think tariffs are a different question because that's a policy choice the government's making. I agree with you. There's a question about whether or not it's the right thing to apply a tariff, which is a tax, right, that will have a feed-through effect on prices. You know, the inflation that we've experienced in the last several years is not a consequence of public spending. It just isn't. The data is pretty clear on that.
Not even the CERB checks?
Well, so there is some, no, hold on. So there is some evidence that there was at the beginning of COVID some fiscal induced inflation in parts of the world. The U.S. was actually far more guilty of that than we are, if you look at the research that's been done by the U.S. Federal Reserve. But Canada's inflation, the shape of inflation in Canada, both in terms of how it peaked and then when it came down and how quickly did it come down, is actually one of the best records in the G7. Now, that is no comfort, obviously, to any household who's been dealing with the painful experience of having to potentially see their shelter costs double if they're dealing with a mortgage. But that's just the truth, right? Like, the US, the UK, France, Italy, Germany, Canada, Japan, we've all experienced different versions of the same problem. Why? Because most of that inflation has been largely due to a combination of supply side factors associated with how the economy had to be reopened, and also associated with things like the war in Ukraine, right? And so it's convenient to say that public spending is a cause for that, but in reality, the research is very clear that it's probably only about 20 to 30% at most. Now, it's true that the inflation could be lower if we had maybe spent less, but that doesn't explain the vast majority of what's happened with inflation. And it's interesting, right? Because if you look at some of the things that have had to shore up household balance sheets, right? Things like dental care benefits, the GST credit, for example. The GST credit, which, by the way, all parties supported, right, which is about a $3 to $4 billion a year spending commitment. That commitment has helped a lot of low-income households be protected from the immediate and very significant cost effects of inflation, right? So we can badmouth spending, but at the end of the day, it's what kind of spending are you making, and is it having an effect? The point I would make, though, is, and this is where I think you and I will probably agree, is that there are things that governments can do in this moment in time that can help to reduce inflation, which doesn't require spending. So there are regulatory tools, for example, that we can use to address price inflation, and I think we haven't perhaps explored enough of what that could represent. We can also cut taxes, and I think that that's actually an area of common interest, and you've even seen Liberals and Conservatives talk at the provincial and federal level about the way in which taxes can be used as a means of cost reduction on the part of households, right? But that is, to an extent, also going to have a fiscal expansionary effect. The last thing I'll just say is, we have to remember at the end of the day that households experience inflation in a very different manner. And I think our goal has to be, how do we protect that kind of bottom 60%, bottom 75% of people who don't have assets, who have very few assets. They don't have liquidity on their balance sheet that they can rely on in order to shore themselves up in moments of crisis. And let's be honest, the government has had to be on the side of those people. And I think there's a really interesting question as we go into this inflation, potentially next bout of inflation caused by tariffs. Do we do something that is going to be broad-based, or do we do something that's targeted? Because I think we've seen the challenges of both different approaches over the course of the last number of years on the part of public policy.
It's a really interesting.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a really interesting point, that last point that he made in terms of the policy challenge that elected officials have, and how wide will they go with a policy solution, or will they really narrow cast it? I guess I would say, what happened during COVID affected it. I think we're going to see shortly, unfortunately, because Trump just said again, just before we walked into this room, that yes, the tariffs are coming on March the 4th, in case you missed that latest Globe and Mail piece that came out just moments ago, that the population is going to be affected, by the tariffs is totally different than I think the population we saw that was greatly affected during COVID, which we saw largely it was a lot of low-wage workers in service industries, often women, often racialized workers who were primarily impacted. But the first tranche of folks, of workers who will be impacted by these tariffs, if Trump does go through with them, actually will be a very different cohort of largely male, so in the oil sector around 75%, in manufacturing around 70%, and largely male and also higher income folks, right? So how does a government approach that problem? I think primarily up until this point, and I'll speak with more of a political hat on right now, we've seen actually a pretty boring, pedestrian, predictable approach from most politicians to the threat of tariffs, right? The Conservatives' approach initially was, we got to call an election right now, and it's got to be a carbon tax election. And so that's kind of a rote response. We've seen Jagmeet Singh, my party's leader, also do something very rote, which is, we got to fix the eye and make sure we're there for people. These are kind of traditional calls that these parties have had. They've just kind of pull out in response. So how different now that the threat is becoming more and more real? I guess I'm really curious in how these parties will respond. And what is quizzical to me, and I'm sure to many of the policy folks in this room, is that why haven't we learned the lessons from the past? Why haven't we learned the lessons from the financial crisis of 2008? Or the COVID crisis, frankly, from just a few short years ago, to actually build in these shock absorbers into our policies and into our economy. Why haven't, I was joking with a policy friend just a while ago that literally like everything old is new again. We're talking about west-east hydro grids. I'm like, oh my God, I was writing press releases about that in 2006 when I worked for Jack Layton. Like these are not new ideas, folks. They're still good ideas.
Internal trade.
Internal trade, but they're not new. And the one thing I want to say, though, about that one point, and where conservatives and liberals do agree, is that we have to be really careful in this moment of instability and unpredictability that we don't actually just kind of Trumpify our policies here, too, because the calls for deregulation and the speed at which people want to deregulate and potentially, change our tax codes, should be looked at quite carefully, because conservatives and other corporate interests will use that, this kind of the fear factor that we're facing right now to make those changes when potentially they shouldn't be made, or I would argue they shouldn't be made.
Are you, Kathleen, seeing anything from, on the affordability question, are you seeing anything from the Ontario election, the dialogue or the conversation that's happening around affordability issues and that you think will be picked up in the federal election in some way?
I think it's very, very likely. So what we're seeing, first of all, the context of an Ontario election that was called quickly, and with the threat of the tariffs, really overhanging the whole election, and the Premier, Doug Ford, wrapping himself in the flag and kind of being real Captain Canada. It's been hard for the other parties, all of the other opposition parties, to try to get some media time and some airspace in that. But one thing that I think Merritt Stiles, the Ontario NDP leader, has done, which I think could be potentially translated to the federal scene, is the grocery rebate. We've seen Jagmeet Singh already call for a cap on certain prices, something that other economists like Isabella Weber have called for as well too. If you study her work, looking at a basket of goods and what the price should be, or he's also called for other things at the federal level. Jagmeet Singh, things like not taking the tax off permanently on things like diapers, which just seems reasonable to me, or car seats, or things like that, or even cell phone fees. Again, back to the septuagenarians and the octogenarians who are running the food bank, one of the things they tell me that they struggle with is the fact that everyone needs a cell phone now. a days. So how can you afford that when you're, living off ODSP or Ontario Works or another program such as that? So I do think the grocery rebate proposal that Merit Stiles has brought forward is something we could see. The idea that a basket of some cap on some grocery prices could be. But I mean, some of the ideas that Jagmeet Singh has put forward already, I think you'll see the party wanting to get entrenched, like pharmacare, dental care, things like that, like the GST tax credit, which was worked collaboratively. Jagmeet proposed and the Liberals introduced, which was an important addition.
So on that idea, I mean, often we talk in very, we are in partisan boxes when we talk about policies, but the fact is that over the years, and not even in recent, in recent years, we've seen policies that have come forward that one government does not abandon, so it keeps it. Tyler, I'm thinking of the universal childcare benefit, which the Harper government introduced and then morphed into the Canada Child Benefit. The working income supplement, which had support from all the parties at different junctures. So is there, let me maybe ask Karen and Tyler, are there any, you think,
come on, we can do it.
are there any potential levers that both parties could get behind, either one introducing it and the other at some future date accepting it as something that they're okay with? Tyler, maybe, or Karen.
Do you want me to go first? So, look, to build on the point that I made earlier, I think there is actually a point of agreement between parties. We're seeing this play out provincially and federally. I think it's a combination of tax cuts, right? You've seen the federal and provincial parties kind of compete actually over some of that territory, especially on things like housing, as to how do we take taxes off of housing, how do we ensure that is one lever that can pass through direct savings, whether it's on development charges or GST, for example, which Pierre Poilievre has talked about. I think there's a lot of opportunity there because there seems to now be a consensus that we have overtaxed housing, and that especially that has a significant cost driver, let alone some of the structural zoning issues as to how you build both for-profit as well as not-for-profit housing. I also think, and it's interesting, I mentioned the GST credit top-up earlier in the pandemic. That was continued for about 3 or 4 years, right? It wasn't renewed in this past budget, but there were, I think, 3 or 4 times in the course of the last 5 years that's been tapped as a policy instrument, and it had all party support, right? And in fact, what was interesting was it was introduced at one time as part of the Prime Minister's kind of first tranche of inflation response in the fall of 2022, after inflation peaked in the summer at about 8%. And he put it forward aggressively, kind of hoping that the Conservatives would vote against it. And Pierre Poilievre sped that thing through the House of Commons like lickety-split as the first thing back from summer vacation, because he didn't want to be seen to be opposing it. And yet that was government spending. So I think, we use some of this rhetoric, but at the end of the day, if you look under the surface, there actually are points of agreement on both the tax on both the tax cut and also the fiscal spending side. I think it just depends on how it's framed. And again, I think the 2 areas in which there seems to be an agreement where there's opportunity is both on food and on housing.
Karen?
He said it all. I have nothing more to say.
It's kumbaya.
No, I was
let me ask
particularly, challenged when I saw Carney walk back on his on the carbon tax that he was so staunch and adamant about so far that he even wrote a huge book about it. Right? Climate has been, at least for a decade, one of the primary tenets of the Liberal Party. I worked for Catherine McKenna before she became Catherine. I think that ideologically, we probably differ in a lot of areas, but one thing that she did really well is she put the term climate in every household across this country. And so to see that team walk back from a large commitment that they saw through despite major adversity and challenge and contest, to me was a bit of a shock, but I guess the polls don't lie, just like the hips don't lie, or however that song goes. And in this case, for political expedience to accomplish, the current end goal, I suppose that it is wise to walk back on that. But how that kind of plays out in the long term, I'll be paying attention.
Well, let me transition to another question, which is around the issue of climate and climate resilience, which is another top issue for voters when they're polled. How do you see that, Karen, playing out in the federal election from a conservative lens? Because as they are intersecting issues in many ways, not just on carbon pricing, and one of the issues is a lot of people will be losing those checks, so people that the money circles back to and actually depend on them. So that's one issue. But also, dealing with climate is expensive for people. And I'm sure in your community you've seen that. I think you told me the forest fires came within 30 kilometers of Dokis. How do you see that playing out in this election? Because the carbon pricing piece is going to have to be made up. The parties are going to have to find different ways of making up those emissions in their arithmetic for meeting our obligations.
So on the checks, I don't know if I have a bit, how wild my position on it is. And this is Karen, the conservative, not, a Polyev platform promoter, is that I actually don't think those checks are helpful at all. I come from a place where people make very little money. Very little money to me in this world is like $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year. And the cost of living has grown exponentially. They can't afford to pay extra on the front end. Here in Ottawa, we're like, oh, it's just an extra $400, or it's just an extra $17, or it's just an extra, yeah, because we make 6 figures individually. Combined household, you're in the $200,000-300,000, and so range. And so, to me, on that checkpoint, it's just astonishing how there's been so little talk about, especially from the parties who claim to represent that particular demographic, but there's been so little talk about that reality. And that's something that, at least in my household, that we've had many conversations about. In terms of climate conservative action, the one announcement that I think went largely unnoticed among Canadians is Pierre's comment on reforestation. So I know somewhere here in my pack of notes, I have the exact amount of carbon emissions caused by the 2023 wildfires. It's astronomical. It competes with some of the largest countries across the globe. And yet, there's been no policy commitment from a Liberal government on tackling that in a very practical and pragmatic way. And I was rather refreshed to see someone come out and with some kind of practical solution to help balance out those emissions. Now, what I would like to see, what I would add to that proposal is a policy and a commitment around upholding Indigenous knowledge, not in a Disney romantic way, but in a very practical way as it comes to prescribed burns. And those who are from rural and remote places across the country also understand the term prescribed burns, because on both sides of my family, French and Ojibwe, this is something that happens annually. People burn their lawns, right? It's a preventative measure, it's a mitigation measure to prevent in the event of, right? And so why aren't we having that conversation? This is a practice that the government has once supported, that it shows no commitment in funding and supporting, but it's one that we could actually do to actively prevent these large-scale, widespread wildfires from tearing up our lands. And then from there, to balance things out, the reforestation commitment or support for that. Sorry, I have a cold and my head is like everywhere. I'm like saying words backwards, it's fine. But his commitment to reforestation, to me, I think is brilliant on a number of fronts. At a time where kids can't get jobs, we have high number of immigration coming in, immigrants are competing for jobs. What better program to have than to equip people with packs of of seedlings and small trees and send them out into the bush as part of a summer program, or even, you know, a Canadian patriotic program, if you will, to truly give back to the land that has given so much to us. It's a wild, fun idea.
Did anyone do tree planting in here when they were younger? There's one, couple, yes.
Yeah, I hear it's not fun. I actually had a roommate in undergrad from Halifax. I did my undergrad at U of T. She tree planted every summer, and man, was she fit when September rolled around. And so that's the other thing that I would say reminds us, is that Canada, like, we've kind of gotten lazy over the years, right? It's time to actually get back to who we are, the hardworking people who care for the land, who benefit from the land, who should give back to the land. And in my view, what better way to do that than to actually literally plant trees and regrow your future?
Kathleen, climate and the federal election.
I'm not going to make it spicy, but I'm just going to disagree with one point with Karen, that there are a lot of hard-working people that are having a lot of trouble making ends meet. And they are hardworking, and they're doing their best to make, you know, life okay for them and their families. And it's really hard to talk to them about climate when they can't afford the daily essentials. And what we have to recognize, and I'm sure everybody in this room does recognize, is that people who are low income are hurt most often by climate change. So, and there's great environmental communicators in this room. I've seen some of you, you know that you have to make this personal to folks in order for it to then impact. And what can be more personal than, you know, in 2023, a 9-year-old boy dying of an asthma attack because of the BC fires, or a construction worker in Toronto in 2024 dying because he was on site working and his work site was flooded because of the flood that came through. Or, I mean, we all remember in 2021 in BC, the heat dome that held over BC and killed hundreds of elderly and low-income folks who lived alone, because they were impacted most, and that's from the BC Coroner's report. So I think we have to take action on climate, even though it's hard when we're facing these affordability, the affordability crisis, which is, and also this economic warfare that we're facing from Trump overall, because it is those on the lower incomes that will be impacted most. And you know, a good friend of mine who happens to be in the room, Brendan Haley, who is an expert on this, but I will cite him that, you know, energy poverty is a real challenge. And I spoke about it a little bit before when I spoke about the challenges that people have, not just paying their rent, but paying for the utilities. So we have to think of solutions moving forward. So I want to be hopeful and positive and a little bit cupful and Pollyanna-ish, and return to the question that you asked previously, Jennifer, and when you said, you know, what do you think we could find consensus among the parties? And I'm hopeful that we can find consensus on at least keeping the industrial carbon price. I mean, I wanted to joke in my kind of partisan way and say, I love Karen, but she must not have hung out with Liberals long enough, because I knew that they would backtrack on those things. Unfortunately, that was my spicy comment. Because, you know, seeing them backtrack on the carbon price is just like, oh.
That's spicy for Tyler, not me.
No, I know, but I was just joking, with you. Like, I've seen this movie before.
I had to take many calls from Kathleen McKenna over the years.
Yeah,
so
but I guess
I would not have predicted that.
I think that we can hopefully agree on that, and hopefully agree on some of the, and we can get into the nitty-gritty on what kind of solutions we propose.
I'm going to move to questions very shortly, but
Sure.
why don't you, if you can, you know, just quickly give us like one or two examples of like twofers where you can address affordability and
retrofitting your homes, right? Like helping people, paying people to help fix their homes to actually make them more energy efficient, right? So, and I know that, because we had a pre-call, so I know that Karen and I will disagree on the issue of heat pumps, but heat pumps still work for a large portion of Canadians where we live and in those communities. And it seems ridiculous to me, if you want to be pragmatic and commonsensical, as her party leader says he is, that we would throw out a tool that works for 90% of the population. It just doesn't make sense. So we should use that, and we should have other tools as well. And certainly it's going to have to be supplemented with electric heat and other forms of heat at times, but if it works for some, I have friends who live in Peterborough. I know that's not as north as Dosie Keys, but it's pretty cold there. I spent several winters in that city, as it is in Ottawa. So we've got to try these things, but we have to look at it through a lens of helping those who are impacted most, right? We have to make it affordable for folks to actually achieve their climate objectives.
Okay, Karen, then we're going to go to
Just say-
questions.
So I nerded out on heat pumps too, because I was like, what is the exact what's the exact temperature where you need to start supplementing? Do you know what it is? Do you want to take a guess?
No, go ahead.
Anybody?
I can tell you what it is.
It's -10.
Sure. Minus 10 right now with the current price on natural gas. That's usually your point where you would do for cost feasibility. It is not where the technology is, because you can go lower.
Okay,
can
a
go
member of the
lower.
audience says you can go lower than -10.
I know, I love this. Remember, we were sitting here and I'm like, there's going to be smart people in this room. And she's like, when I moderate, I do Socratic method. I'm really mean. Like, I'll just call out a guy and I'll be like, what do you think about this? So this is great. But my point is -10, but you're supplementing, right? And a -10 in Toronto, when you live in a condo and your neighbors are jacking the heat, I don't even need to turn on my heat in the winter in the condo in Toronto. But up north in my house, I have like 3 sources of heat on the go, because that is cold and frigid weathers, and my home isn't surrounded by other people who are taking advantage of heat sources. But -10 and you're having to supplement, I'm hard pressed to think that in Peterborough that is a doable solution.
Choosing where your economic feasibility is. So at that point, you would be better off to switch to natural gas, because above that, you pay less in electricity over that.
So what I'm hearing from Kathleen is that we should do a buffet price instead of a la carte.
I don't understand the
You can fill your plate with different kinds of heat sources, and heat pumps becomes one of them.
It's a tool. We shouldn't throw it out. Yeah.
Oh, maybe we found consensus on this panel. I am going to move to questions first online, and my colleague Clea is going to read us one, and then we'll go to the room.
Thanks. So we've had about 100 people join us online. So thanks, Zoom people, for being with us. Also, a lot of comments about the heat pump issue just now. So thank you for joining in. Heat pump people. A lot of corrections coming in from the online folks as well, who are saying my heat pump doesn't require supplemental heat until -30. So hopefully we're done with -30 this winter. But I'll ask a question from Riley Urban, who says, how much does urban planning and creative architecture play into our solution? A Canadian standard house is larger than a European home, and everyone gets a lawn. How does building smaller fit into your vision of a future for Canada? Tighter, walkable communities with more third places.
Yeah, well, I'll just plug the Affordability Action Council's work on, focusing building housing near transit. So, we didn't address the size of houses, but we did address, if you're going to build those units, then you might as well do them in areas where people can easily access nodes. Now, that's not, we have a whole other brief on rural transit, which is a different set of issues, but does anyone have a comment about the size of housing and
I'd just like to point out that that was one of Pierre's earlier announcements, is to focus on building housing close to, current and functioning transportation infrastructure. So a little nod out to Polyev. He may know a thing or two.
Or David Eby, who's already doing it in the province of British Columbia.
But that's so far. We don't really know.
Still part of Canada.
There.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'll just say, yes, it has a role. I think the challenge, though, is that, we've seen, and I think this has been a bit of a societal awakening in the course of the last number of years, and I credit Pierre Poilievre to having some part of that, not entirely, because I think there's a lot of action that this government has been doing in the last couple of years as well on that file. But I think we have come to realize that there is a basic problem in how we produce enough homes in this country that is linked to the difficulty with which it is to build, in part because of very restrictive zoning policies. And so before we get into a debate about whether we should, change urban form, I'd like to build some stuff first. And if it has greater density, that's great. And there's ways to do that, as Karen said, in terms of transit-oriented development, something that this federal government has also been very interested in and working on. But at the end of the day, the first order priority, if we want to improve affordability for housing, is going to be we have to build more housing. And how do we do that? We've got to change the structure and ways in which we build housing, and that includes breaking down barriers. And I will say, dare I say, the word gatekeeping by municipalities. I think one criticism, a self-criticism of the government is that I think we've been too nice with mayors. I think that there are municipalities that have looked at housing as a source of revenue, and that's in part because of the very perverse way that we fund municipalities in this country, a debate that we should have actually about how we fund municipalities. But the consequence has been that we have made it very difficult to build. And so before we get into debating architectural form, I'd rather like to build stuff.
Does that include non-market housing? So
Absolutely.
A shout out to Carolyn
Absolutely.
Weitzman, who's written on this extensively, but the Liberal government of the 90s moved out of funding affordable housing, non-market housing. I think that the magnitude of the number of units that will have to be created is well over 1 million to restore availability for people who can simply not afford market housing. Yeah. Do you see that the Liberals getting back into that space?
I mean, the government has. I mean, that's been the whole purpose of the National Housing Strategy since it was created in 2017. I mean, now, has the National Housing Strategy gotten everything right? No, it's why it's been having had to be a living, iterative process that has gone through kind of generational changes even in the course of the last couple of years. But yeah, the problem was we stopped building affordable housing and stopped building non-market housing and also stopped building market rental housing of all kinds in the 90s, but even starting in that trend was starting in the 80s, but governments had been out of the business of housing for the last 3 decades, basically. That was something that was consistent from Jean Chrétien to Stephen Harper to until Justin Trudeau came along. And it takes a long time to rebuild that effort. But the National Housing Strategy, this National Housing Strategy has already built 100,000 units of housing. The problem is that the challenge, the scale of the challenge that we face in the housing market is so much greater as an order of magnitude that it doesn't feel like it's had much effect, but it has.
I have a wild idea. Multi-generational homes. I think we should look into tax breaks for those who are willing to live together. And I heard some chuckles over here. I think post-pandemic, we have serious mental health issues across the country. People are lonely. They've had to live alone. They've been told not to engage with one another. And there's remnants from that. And looking at restoring family units, bringing people together. And on the flip side, if we're talking about keeping warm, I mean, what better way to keep warm than argue with your own family members?
So I agree with this. The multi-generational housing tax credit was in the 2022 budget. It was approved and voted against by the Conservatives.
Oh, interesting.
But there's
Plot twist.
But to Karen's point, not a lot of apartment-style living is multi-generational. Houses is one issue,
right.
but when you're looking for rental, there's not a whole lot of it that will take a family that has 6 members or 7 members. But I'm going to go to a question in the room. Does Clea, do you have the microphone? Okay, so I see some questions.
Thanks, Jennifer, and the panel. Chris Henderson with the National Not-for-Profit Indigenous Clean Energy. I wondered whether the question for the panel should have been, how can climate action help affordability? Give you the 2 examples on the Indigenous front. Indigenous communities today own 20% or co-own 20% of Canada's electricity generating infrastructure. 20 years ago was 0. Including the Oki-Kenduk project and the Dokis First Nation.
I was just going to say, which you led.
Which I led.
Well, co-led.
Oh, co-led. No, the chief led.
You stole my line. I was going to tell the room.
I know. So we can do more of that. What's it creating almost $300 to $400 million a year in net income that Indigenous communities get as partners in commercial terms that they're reinvesting in their communities, which helps affordability at the community level. I loved your point that you had, Catherine, in terms of affordability and retrofits. 300,000 homes in Indigenous communities need to be retrofitted. But we've done the analysis, the numbers are hard. The amount of tax revenue, job creation, climate reduction, affordability, and improved health care, if we do that, vastly helps with affordability. So I think the real question is, how does climate action help with affordability?
Thank you. Love that question.
And maybe we could actually kind of combine a previous answer and kind of create almost like a climate core. You know what I mean? Like you were talking about this tree planting idea, but if we are going to have some layoffs in the next little bit as a result of this not policy-induced recession, but politico crazy man-induced recession that these tariffs may cause, and we're looking for ways to get folks employed and skilled and trained up, maybe retrofits are a way, right? Like get the training, get our economy going. Lots of people have written about different ways to do that as a post-tariff reaction. I mean, Michael Sabia has some good ideas out of Hydro-Quebec, but this could be another idea, right?
Well, Pierre Poilievre, I think in part of his recent speech, talked about getting more kids out across the country for French immersion programs. Maybe we can double up on the tree planting, the French immersion, and the retrofits. And
This reminds me of 2 billion trees. Are you all endorsing 2 billion trees as a, no? Sorry.
2 billion trees is trying to plant 2 billion trees before 2031. That is an initiative that this government has brought that I'm very surprised that you weren't familiar with.
Oh, well, okay.
I'm speaking to
Thank you. We have another question from online, Clea?
Yes, we do, and the 2 billion trees also is being mentioned online, so we've got some psychic folks coming in on Zoom. Sarah asks, what changes or increases would be helpful to EI and the Canada Child Benefit once the impact of tariffs hit our economy and worsen the affordability crisis?
Thank you.
Can I take that?
Yeah, sure.
So I actually think EI is the wrong tool to address tariffs. I know why the government is probably keen to want to use EI because they have the authorities to use it under the pilot project authorities that exist in the Employment Insurance Act without having to go through Parliament. That's great. I mean, that's great, but it's a completely ineffective tool, I would argue, because to the point that Kathleen was making, this is going to be a broad-based effect, right? And some of the kinds of people who are going to be affected by this are people who have not traditionally had insured earnings or have had insured earnings but need more support than we would traditionally offer them if we simply expanded EI. So I think actually this is a time in which, dare I say, and I'm going to probably be pilloried for this, we actually should look at some of the lessons that we learned from the pandemic, right, where we were trying to provide broad-based income supports. Now, I'm not suggesting that we return to CERB. I think there was a good experience in that and public opinion subsequently that says maybe we shouldn't do that. And I agree. Like I think the public opinion is that we shouldn't do that. But perhaps something like a wage insurance program or a wage subsidy program, which did actually keep 6 million people employed during the pandemic, is a way to stem that tide, because the best thing we can do is to actually make sure that people don't lose their job, right? If they continue to have a paycheck coming in, that's a far more effective way to deal with the inflation crisis than to have them be unemployed, try to find them a new job, try to retrain them, all while there's a high degree of uncertainty about what's going to happen in terms of the policy response.
On EI, because this is something that the Institute's done research on, I'll just know that it was, Rachel, only 40% of Canadians that are eligible for EI, and
Get access. Actually can access it.
and a paltry amount that they get per month. So I'm just thinking, Tyler, there'll probably be many people who end up on EI regardless. So it's probably something that needs to be modernized.
For sure, and the challenge with EI is that it's a payment program that's based on a very outdated technology. This is where Doge actually could be very helpful to us. No, I mean, it's true.
Am I writing Doge? Lightning just came from the sky.
No, but it's true. Like it's a punch card system. It's literally based on Cobalt, and so like that system, if it gets hundreds of thousands more people who are going to claim benefits, is going to creak along and have difficulty in being able to get income to people in a short period of time. Like this is what we learned in the pandemic. If the goal is to get money in the hands of people quickly so that their income is maintained, their job is maintained, they don't have to deal with the uncertainty about how they're going to pay their bills on top of an existing affordability crisis, EI is not the solution to do that.
The wrinkle I'll put, I won't debate Tyler, but the wrinkle I'll put in all this is that we're seeing the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, and virtually all of the Liberal leadership candidates right now saying that they want to make some serious cuts in the public service. So if that is the direction of the next government, whoever is the next government, and we have to roll out these programs immediately to help people either stay connected to their jobs, have a paycheck, or enroll in a social program like EI, I ask you, who is going to implement that program? Because those people will not be there. And it was, in fact, the public service who was able to roll out those programs so quickly, lightning, like a fire hose coming at us in terms of policies and new programs during the COVID pandemic, that actually did help Canada survive the pandemic so much better than other countries. And I get that no one wants anybody to be doing victory laps right now, any of the political leadership right now. So it doesn't help to compare ourselves to other nations. But it was the backbone of the public service that implemented those policies.
Thank you. Another question from the room? Jean-Marc?
Merci, Jean-Marc, proud owner of heat pumps that do work until -30. But my spouse was descent from Africa. And when it's -20, the fireplace is on all night long. I want to go back to the tariff and the economic warfare and then kind of follow up to your question. So if it triggers a recession, this inflation, the dollar goes down, and then the government's under real pressure to manage a fiscal framework, but can't because of this. Do we go back to tools that we haven't used since the Second World War? Price control, war bonds. Is that even on the table?
Interesting
Can I just
question.
quickly speak to that? Well, certainly the New Democrats have put forward an idea of doing some price controls on things like food, like the basket of goods. And we could go back to a program, not to raise the name of the town that I grew up in again, but Ajax, Ontario, was an example of wartime housing that was built through government, right? So all the houses in North Ajax or Middle Ajax are small bungalows that were built by the government and given to veterans when they returned from the war. And they're small little bungalows, and they're still populated today. And that was a government program. We could move back to that kind of stuff. I mean, it could work if we're facing, we do have to look internally, you know what I mean? And what we could do to keep people working and build the infrastructure we need. So, and I think price controls, I cited Isabel Weber earlier. Her work is fascinating. I encourage you to take a look at it. But is an option on certain goods like bread, grains, certain things that people need every day. We have controls on other parts of our economy. It would make sense potentially on one of the most important, that being food, that there be some controls there as well. Tyler's going to agree.
I think everything should be on the table, and I think to the point of the question, I think it will require a version of wartime effort. I think, though, what's also required in that respect is to think critically about how we deal with this as a supply side problem, right? And in supply side shocks, which this will be a version of, it requires us to think about how we rebuild a lot of those supply chains, and what is the role of government potentially in helping to build the domestic capacity in a number of key sectors. Food is one of them, right? Housing is another. Critical minerals is another, in terms of how we secure our own supply chains. How we think about, for example, building our own public infrastructure programs. I think there's been some interesting commentary from Doug Ford in the course of this provincial election about the way that can play out. I think it will be interesting to see whether others want to follow suit. So there are things that governments can do, but it's going to require in some ways a much more interventionist role of government, regardless of who's in power, right, in terms of actually trying to plan and manage the economy. We're going back to, industrial policy of about 70 years ago, to be honest.
Well, this is a topic that's very interesting to us at the Institute. Karen, I know that Pierre Poilievre has said no more corporate welfare, but it would seem that there's going to be some kind of role for government. Let's say, as Tyler mentioned, expanding our capacity to grow things in Canada, looking at which industries we want to invest in further, defense industries, I won't get into that, but on the affordability side, investing in agriculture might actually be something that's of interest to us.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a Western alienation issue, is the way I see it, is again, center of the universe over here. We only look, to the economies that are local to us, that are within reach to us, that we see, can feel, and touch. Growing up in northeastern Ontario, 4 hours north of Toronto, we felt that alienation, right? There's entire economies that have been sustained for decades and centuries that are not front of mind to policymakers here in Ottawa. And so that obviously seems like a common sense thing to do, is like, what do you have in your backyard? This is something that I often say with First Nations when people, non-Indigenous primarily, question, why are First Nations so poor? And it's like, well, we're trying to leverage what we have in our own backyard, but there's red tape. In our case, the red tape is the Indian Act that prevents us from developing those resources and accessing those resources, and exercising them and developing how we see fit. And I think that's a perfect parallel to where our country is at right now, is that in a lot of ways, we don't see it, but if we do see it, we're strapped in by all kinds of regulation that just prevents us from getting to it and doing something with it in a timely fashion.
Thank you. We'll have one more question, I think, and then we'll wrap up. Hi.
Hi, my name is Danny Prapavisis. I work for a sustainability consulting firm, and I actually work virtually, and so it's so nice being in a room with people. And so thank you for putting on this event. My question is somewhat conceptual, so just bear with me as I try and describe it. I guess I'm curious how you three would define affordability in terms of the goal of increasing people's ability to pay for things and afford things versus actually decreasing the cost of things. And I'm particularly curious about housing. I'm a millennial, I'm not a home owner, but I'm very well aware that there's a big generation ahead of me that doesn't really want house prices to go down because their retirement might be based in, a certain house price or a certain vision that they had of their future. And so I guess in context of housing and affordability, do you think good solutions that are going to be impactful for all are about kind of allowing a next generation to be able to afford what's there, or actually lowering prices?
Thank you. You're channeling Paul Kershaw, I think I hear a little bit in there. Yeah.
It's the whole scarcity breeds value and profit, right? If there are no homes to choose from, those who do have homes will increase in value and pocket more cash. And I really feel for young people and young families today who are trying to figure it out in that market. And go back to the comment I just made. And actually Tyler spoke about, just what do you do in this? You cut back or you make more. In this case, on housing, you have to make more. Also, our population has increased how much in the last 5 years alone? And that's not proportional to the amount of, to the number of homes that have been built. And then to Jen's earlier point about size of home, there's a lot of condos downtown, 400 or 500 square feet, that are selling for an astronomical price. Well, you can be a yuppie, a young urban professional, that maybe that you can afford that. But the challenge is young families of 2, 3, 4 individuals, are they going to buy that 400 square foot condo for 600 grand? Number one, they can't afford that. Number two, even if they could, are they willing to live in such small quarters? And so I think you raise a good point, along with a number of considerations there that we're contending with, and I think will be.
Do you see any scenario under which Conservative government might consider a tax on your profit on the sale of your house, on your primary residence? Given the billions and billions and billions of dollars that Gen Xers and Boomers are sitting on.
I mean, fiscal policy is not my strong point. I took tax law when I studied at U Ottawa Law, and I think it was interesting for the first 3 classes, and then I struggled to stay awake. So that is best left with professionals. But is there a taxation policy solution on that front? Likely. How popular will it be? Unlikely, but.
What What about on the Liberal, that's like a sacred
That's
cow.
never going to happen. That's
Never
never,
gonna-
like, it's
never
just
gonna
ne-
happen.
I've heard Paul make a very convincing, passionate case about this. It's never going to happen, and it's never going to happen because there's a political consensus to protect, across all parties, right? To protect house prices, because to a certain extent, if you want people to invest in things, they have to know that their assets will be protected, right? And that their asset prices will go up. That's the perverse nature
But real
of what
estate
we're-
is the only thing that Canadians really invest in Canada.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's
the
right.
problem.
That's
Can I
right.
speak
That's
to
the problem.
that
And-
issue?
yeah, and that's an issue.
So first of all, Tyler's right. It will never happen, unfortunately, because there's a direct correlation between homeowners and their propensity to vote. So, right, if you own a home, you're going to vote. And so that's why, unfortunately, most politicians won't address this issue and put the tax on homes in that way. The problem fundamentally, in my opinion, is, and this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, so bear with me now, is that houses should never be our retirement plan, ever. Like ever. It should be a place to find shelter and be safe and hopefully form community, and maybe raise some children if that's your choice. But the problem is we don't have other strong retirement financial vehicles, right? We can go to the private sector and give all our money to one of the big 6 banks, and they can, we can pay them fees for that. What we should be doing, insert hobby horse, is allowing Canadians to actually invest in some way into the CPP, which is an amazing vehicle that is we communally, invest in, but we can't personally invest in some way. So figure out a way how we could do that, and then people wouldn't use their home as their only retirement vehicle. And that's also an exclusive group of people. I want to be clear on that not everybody can afford to buy a house, have a house, and use that as a retirement vehicle. But it's because of the erosion of defined benefit pension plans, of workplace pension plans, and no other way that people can actually find a way that their asset can reliably increase and not be subject to the whims of the market, or frankly subject to the whims of bank fees, financial fees.
Thank you. Well, I've heard a lot of interesting ideas, and then actually some areas of consensus, which surprises me. So thank you so much. Thank you, Karen, Tyler, and Kathleen, and thank you for all the questions in the room. And for those of you here in Ottawa, sorry people in live stream, but there are some things to eat and drink on the other side of these doors. And I appreciate the questions in the room, and if you want to continue to chat, we love that. And thanks very much. And I just want to thank also the different members of the Affordability Action Council who I see here, and the Trottier and McConnell Foundations who supported the work of this council. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next event. Yes.
Just before we wrap up. I just want to say it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with these two amazing women and yourself, Jennifer. My mother's going to kill me because I'm sure she's watching the live stream for my facial reactions, but it's great. It's great. It's great to have had this conversation, because I think you're right that there is partisanship, there's being political, but there's also in between those two things an ability and a space to kind of agree on some stuff, and I think we do.
Thank you. Very well said. Thank you.
Compliments. I want to recognize the humility that you exercised here this evening, Tyler, and conceding to some very real, some realities that have played out from Liberal policy that you've been, humble enough to say that maybe weren't the best direction.
And
I
can we come to the hockey game next year?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. You guys, we'll go ice fishing. Everybody's invited.
All right.
Let's see what good climate investments can protect at the end of the day.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.